My talk today is on foreign policy, but of course the ultimate role of foreign policy is to protect and advance the interests of this nation, and that rests upon our domestic foundations that are very important. Today, the United States is formally at peace. However, Washington is deeply involved in a proxy war in Europe with a nuclear-armed power over interests that power considers to be vital. NATO is at the center of that conflict between Ukraine and Russia. Yet we see resistance growing across the United States and Europe to writing additional blank checks for Kyiv. As NATO's 75th anniversary approaches, NATO's advocates are worried about its future, and such concern, frankly, is long overdue. After former President Donald Trump sarcastically encouraged adversaries of NATO to attack members who left their defense to Washington, predictable hysteria raged across the Atlantic. The New York Times reported European leaders were quietly discussing how they might prepare for a world in which America removes itself as the alliance's centerpiece. With one snarky aside, Trump might have done more to encourage European self-sufficiency than any other president. Perhaps even more than Vladimir Putin has done. For that, Donald Trump deserves our thanks. At NATO's creation in 1949, few of its founders would have imagined today's organization. It routinely presents itself as the most successful alliance in human history. It certainly is the most powerful. NATO may also be the world's most enduring alliance, at least in recent history. Has it been the most effective as well? The alliance shielded Western Europe from potential Soviet aggression, allowing countries ravaged by war to recover and to move forward. Although Moscow might not have attacked even without NATO, the transatlantic compact ensured that no Soviet leader would seriously consider making the attempt. However, in recent years, the United States has treated NATO rather like a gentleman's club to which all respectable states should be invited to join. Hence the accession of such military midgets as Montenegro and North Macedonia. The Duchy of Grand Fenwick, of the Mouse that Roared fame, might be the next applicant. All of these countries receive the Holy Grail, nuclear protection by the United States. Yet today, some NATO members seem to be turning tail, frightened that even an embattled Russia, after 2 hideous years of war, might be prepared to move westward. Last week, the Danish defense minister saw the Russian Federation not only on the verge of victory in Ukraine, but apparently preparing to launch a new blitzkrieg elsewhere. He said it cannot be ruled out that within a 3 to 5 year period, Russia will test Article 5, the defense commitment part of NATO, and NATO's solidarity. So the question we should ask is, what is the alliance's future? NATO was created in 1949 with 12 members. In practice, NATO means North America, mostly the US, though with Canada along, and the others. In 1949, the United Kingdom was rapidly retreating from great power status. Belgium, Denmark, France, Italy, and the Netherlands, and Norway all had been defeated in war and occupied by the Germans. Portugal was a distant and weak neutral. Iceland offered bases rather than troops. Minuscule Luxembourg is stuck between France, Belgium, and Germany. Now, despite the developing Cold War, NATO's creation was opposed by some conservatives, led by Ohio Senator Robert Taft, often known as Mr. Republican. Even leading proponents of NATO warned against making the alliance members dependent upon the United States. In contrast to today, when the current administration insists on steadily increasing U.S. commitments to Europe, then James McAllister, author of No Exit, America and the German Problem, wrote, American policymakers from Franklin Delano Roosevelt to Dwight Eisenhower strenuously tried to avoid having the future of Europe dependent on a permanent U.S. military presence on the continent. For instance, in 1949, Secretary of State Dean Acheson answered a clear and absolute no when asked by U.S. senators if a permanent U.S. garrison would be necessary. Eisenhower, who before serving as president was the first supreme commander of NATO, was equally emphatic. He said, we cannot be a modern Rome guarding the far frontiers with our legions if for no other reason than these are not politically our frontiers. What we must do is assist these people to regain their confidence and get on their own military feet. That is 70 years ago when he spoke those words. What we must do is assist these people to do. Indeed, officials believe that Washington was acting to foreclose a long-term permanent military involvement. Mark Sheets wrote that the purpose of America's temporary intervention in Western Europe was to eliminate the need for permanent intervention. Yet this objective faded even as America's military commitments around the world, especially in Asia, expanded dramatically. The U.S. occupied Japan after World War II, unoccupied that country until 1952, leaving a garrison that remains to this day. American forces fought a brutal war on the Korean Peninsula, afterwards retraining troops who also remain today. 3 successive presidents made a major military commitment to Vietnam, with the strength peaking at 543,000 in April 1969. Even when the United States enjoyed peacetime, it was prepared for war around the world, acting as Eisenhower's modern Rome, guarding the far frontiers with our legions. Despite this heavy global burden borne by the American people, European governments consistently underperformed militarily. European leaders often promised to do more, but almost as regularly failed to keep their commitments. After all, there was no penalty for treating Uncle Sam as a sucker, other than having to put up with a lot of whining and whinging and an occasional rhetorical horsewhipping from a succession of U.S. officials. One unnamed European diplomat recently admitted to Fox News, quote, "When Trump came along, it woke us up to the fact that the U.S. might not always act in European interest, especially if it goes against American interests. Until then," the diplomat explained, "that was an assumption a lot of people made." Now, you have to wonder, why would the American people be skeptical of their government if it put up with that for decades? At times, even official Washington really expressed its anger. Nearly 13 years ago, soon-to-retire Defense Secretary Robert Gates criticized Europe's indifferent military efforts. "I've worried openly about NATO turning into a two-tiered alliance between members who specialize in soft humanitarian development, peacekeeping, and talking tasks, and those of conducting the hard combat missions. This is no longer a hypothetical worry," he said. "We are there today, and it is unacceptable." Yet little has changed since then, at least until very recently. But how could it be any different when U.S. policymakers consistently promoted this vision? When criticized by the Europeans, American administrations often increased force levels in Europe and sent top officials to the continent to reassure NATO members that America would always be there, no matter how little they did. Vice President Joe Biden, no surprise, was the Obama administration's official reassurance ambassador. Congress funded a reassurance initiative, essentially rewarding European governments so they didn't doubt Washington's commitment to the alliance. In short, the U.S. was so desperate for its allies' approval that it invited them to cheap ride on America. Now, the Obama administration justified this rather bizarre process based on NATO's backing after 9/11, and that was certainly welcome. However, offering modest support to combat a distant insurgency is not comparable to providing the bulk of forces to wage a full-scale conventional war and possible nuclear war on the continent of Europe. Yet NATO wannabes like Georgia, the country, not the state, aided U.S. operations elsewhere to advance their NATO candidacies. Unfortunately, this practice continued under President Trump. Although he was greatly frustrated by Europe's reliance on the US and expressed his feelings in, shall we say, undiplomatic terms, his officials often undercut his efforts. Observe the Heritage Foundation in early 2020. Today, more American troops are on the ground in Europe than under President Obama, and the United States has substantially boosted its deterrence or reassurance initiative, increasing it by nearly 50%, or $6.5 billion. Worse, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Biden administration added another 20,000 US troops to Europe. However, a second Trump administration might turn out rather differently. Trump loyalists are talking about the importance of staffing the administration, or a potential venture at this stage, but nevertheless clearly a serious potential one, of staffing that venture with people ready to uphold rather than obstruct Trump's policies. Moreover, last week he publicly criticized the Europeans in perhaps his sharpest tone yet. He recalled being asked whether he would defend an underperforming NATO member, and he responded, quote, "I said, you didn't pay? You're delinquent. No, I would not protect you. In fact, I would encourage them to do whatever they want. You gotta pay," which triggered wailing, gnashing of teeth, and rending of garments on a biblical scale in both Washington and Brussels. The failure of Europe to seriously arm and protect itself is but one of the serious challenges facing NATO. Another is the alliance's go-go expansion after the end of the Cold War. Beginning with 12 states in 1949, the alliance added only 4 new members through 1982. A decade later, the Warsaw Pact and then the Soviet Union collapsed. This unmitigated good news eliminated the justification for the alliance, creating an existential crisis. For a time, NATO too appeared to be heading into history's famed trash bin. Desperate alliance advocates proposed that the organization, and I'm not making this up, that the organization reorganize to fight the illicit drug trade and promote student exchanges. I unkindly proposed turning tanks into bookmobiles, able to shoot desired texts to waiting readers. That was not adopted, I'm afraid. Demonstrating the predictive power of public choice economics, NATO officials settled on an out-of-area activities as the new role. Defense against Moscow is out. Imposing the Allies' will on other states was in. Moreover, the alliance essentially decided to act as an international welcome wagon for nations and Soviet republics freed from communist bondage, which meant expanding NATO. Despite the vastly improved security climate, Washington greatly increased its defense obligations and did so to nations with little military importance to America. The process has continued, with Finland joining in 2023, while Sweden awaits final approval from Hungary's parliament. Most controversial is the status of Georgia and Ukraine. Promised membership at NATO's 2008 summit at the insistence of the Bush administration, the two governments remain outside the alliance. Both had unresolved border disputes with Russia, as we've seen very clearly. And despite NATO members' welcoming rhetoric, none of them actually wanted to defend either of those countries. The alliance's expansion raised 2 critical issues, both foolishly, I think even rashly dismissed in Washington. The first is the violation of commitments made to the Gorbachev and Yeltsin governments, which helped keep the process of Soviet military withdrawal and political collapse peaceful. Based on declassified documents, George Washington University cited a cascade of assurances about Soviet security policy given by Western leaders to Gorbachev and other Soviet officials throughout the process of German unification in 1990 and on into 1991. The Allies continued similarly sweet-talked the Yeltsin government and then violated their promises. The Clinton administration decided that Moscow had lost, so its concerns could be trod underfoot. Former Defense Secretary William Perry, who served Clinton, admitted that, as he put it, "In the early years, I have to say that the United States deserves much of the blame. he explained, quote, "Our first action that really set us off in a bad direction was when NATO started to expand, bringing in Eastern European nations, some of them bordering on Russia." Equally problematic was NATO's war against Yugoslavia, which demonstrated that the alliance's new out-of-area stance was aggressive, attacking a country that had not threatened a single NATO member. The Allies' Serbian carve-up, without considering Moscow's views, angered Russian President Boris Yeltsin. He said that he, quote, "told NATO, the Americans, and the Germans, don't push us towards military action." Allied policy sparked an almost comedic Russian race to Pristina, Kosovo, which Wesley Clark, then NATO's supreme commander, sought to stop by force. Thankfully, he was thwarted by his British deputy, General Michael Jackson, who famously responded, "I'm not going to start the Third World War for you."